The neighbors whispered as Margaret walked past their porches, her 3 children trailing behind like small shadows. She could feel their eyes burning into her back, hear the hushed comments about the widow who couldn't keep her lawn trimmed, whose paint was peeling, whose children wore clothes a size too small. But none of them spoke louder than Gerald Henderson from number 42. If you enjoy stories like this, comment "I like it." Leave your like and subscribe to the channel so you don't miss the next ones. Margaret's husband, Thomas, had been gone for 8 months. A heart attack at 39, sudden as summer lightning, leaving her with 3 children under 10, a mortgage she could barely pronounce, and a checking account that seemed to evaporate faster than morning dew. She had been a stay-at-home mother, her world carefully constructed around soccer practices, school lunches, and the warm certainty of Thomas coming home at 6:15 every evening. Now that world had shattered into 1,000 pieces, and she was desperately trying to glue them back together with minimum wage and prayers. Sarah was 9, with her father's gentle brown eyes that now carried shadows too deep for a child. Michael was 7, suddenly quiet where he had once been boisterous, as if his laughter had been buried alongside his father. And little Emma, just 5 years old, still sometimes set a place for Daddy at dinner, her small face confused when Margaret gently removed the extra plate. Margaret worked 2 jobs now, cashier at the grocery store from 6 in the morning until 2 in the afternoon, then cleaning offices downtown from 4 until midnight. She survived on 3 hours of sleep and the stubborn hope that somehow, someday, things would get better. But Gerald Henderson seemed determined to make sure that day never came. He was a man who measured his worth by the precision of his hedge trimming and the shine of his German sedan. Retirement had given him endless time to police the neighborhood, to notice every blade of grass out of place, every garbage can left out past collection day. And Margaret's house, with its overgrown yard and peeling shutters, offended his sense of order, like a stain on his perfectly pressed life. At first, his comments had been veiled in false concern. "Shame about the yard, Margaret, if you need recommendations for a landscaper." But as weeks turned into months and Margaret remained too exhausted and too broke to hire anyone, his remarks grew sharper, more pointed, delivered with a smile that never reached his cold blue eyes. One Saturday morning, as Margaret tried to wrangle the ancient pushmower across her front lawn, while simultaneously keeping Emma from wandering into the street, Gerald appeared at his property line like a disapproving statue. "You know," he called out, loud enough for the Johnsons and the Pratts to hear, "there are neighborhoods for people who can't maintain their properties. Perhaps you should consider one of those." Margaret's hands tightened on the mower handle until her knuckles went white. She wanted to scream at him, to tell him that she was doing her best, that she was drowning, and his cruelty was the stone tied to her ankles. Instead, she swallowed the hot tears burning behind her eyes and pushed the mower forward, the old motor sputtering like her own failing courage. The children heard everything. Sarah's jaw clenched in a way that reminded Margaret achingly of Thomas. Michael's shoulders hunched as if trying to make himself invisible. And Emma, sweet Emma, looked up at the tall man with the mean voice and asked in her clear, innocent voice, "Why is that man so angry, Mommy?" That night, after she had finally gotten all 3 children to bed, Margaret sat at her kitchen table surrounded by bills she couldn't pay and job applications that never called back. She allowed herself exactly 5 minutes to cry, her face buried in her hands, her whole body shaking with exhaustion and desperation and rage at the unfairness of it all. Then she wiped her eyes, made herself a cup of weak tea, and started planning how she would make it through another week. But Margaret Henderson carried something her neighbor could never see, something forged in the fires of loss and necessity. Before Emma was born, before the comfortable suburban life, Margaret had been a different person. She had put herself through community college while working nights at a diner, graduated with honors in accounting, worked her way up to senior bookkeeper at a mid-sized firm. She had been good, really good, with numbers, with patterns, with seeing solutions where others saw only problems. When she and Thomas decided to start a family, she had stepped back from her career willingly, joyfully even, believing there would be time later to return. Life, as it turned out, had other plans. Now, in the dark hours after midnight when the office cleaning was done and the children slept, Margaret sat with library books and free online courses, rebuilding skills that had gone dormant but never disappeared. She studied accounting software that hadn't existed when she left the workforce. She learned about digital marketing, social media management, remote work opportunities. Her eyes burned with fatigue, and her hands cramped from gripping the mop at work and the mouse at home. But she kept going, because Gerald Henderson's cruelty, intended to break her, had instead ignited something fierce and unstoppable inside her chest. The breaking point came on a Tuesday evening in October. Margaret arrived home from her cleaning shift at 12:30 to find Sarah still awake, sitting at the kitchen table with her math homework, tears streaming down her face. "I can't do it, Mom," she sobbed. "I don't understand fractions, and there's no one to help me, and everyone at school thinks we're poor and weird now, and I just want Dad back." Margaret held her daughter, feeling the small body shake with grief and frustration, and something crystallized in her mind. This couldn't be their life. She couldn't let her children grow up defined by loss and struggle and the judgment of small-minded people like Gerald Henderson. The next morning, Margaret did something she hadn't done in 8 months. She called in sick to both her jobs. She dropped the children at school, drove to the public library, and spent 8 straight hours applying for remote accounting positions. She tailored each application with the precision she once used to balance corporate books. She highlighted her education, her experience, her skills, but also her situation, her resilience, her desperate need for an opportunity. She applied to 43 positions that day. By the time she picked up the children from school, her eyes were blurred with screen fatigue and her heart hammered with a mixture of hope and terror. What if no one called? What if she had just sacrificed 2 days' wages for nothing? 3 days later, her phone rang. A small startup company, barely 2 years old, needed someone to manage their accounts remotely. The pay was modest but steady, with health insurance and the ability to work from home. "We're looking for someone hungry," the owner said during the phone interview. "Someone who won't just punch a clock but will help us build something." Margaret's voice shook as she responded, "I'm hungry enough to eat the clock." She got the job. 2 weeks' notice to her other employers. 2 weeks of barely sleeping as she prepared to leap into this new, terrifying opportunity. The children sensed the change in her, the way a tightly coiled spring might sense the moment before release. Sarah started smiling again. Michael's voice grew louder at dinner. Emma drew pictures of their family with a bright yellow sun overhead. Gerald Henderson, of course, noticed nothing except that Margaret's car was now in the driveway during the day. "Home during working hours," he commented loudly to his wife during one of their evening walks. "Must be nice to live off government assistance." His wife, Martha, a quiet woman who rarely contradicted her husband, touched his arm gently. "Gerald, perhaps we don't know the whole story." He shrugged her off irritably. "I know enough. I know property values, and that house is dragging down the entire street." Margaret threw herself into her new position, with the intensity of someone who knew this was her last, best chance. She worked while the children were at school, worked after they went to bed, worked during lunch breaks and weekends. She organized the startup's chaotic financial records, identified cost savings, created systems where only disorder had existed before. Within 2 months, she had saved the company $17,000 through better vendor negotiations and tax strategies the previous accountant had missed. The owner, a young entrepreneur named David Chen, was astounded. "Where have you been all my life?" he joked during their weekly video call. "Surviving," Margaret answered simply. As autumn turned to winter, small changes began appearing at number 37. Margaret hired neighborhood teenagers to rake the leaves and trim the hedges, paid them fairly from her first real paycheck in nearly a year. She ordered paint online and spent a Saturday with all 3 children turning the peeling shutters a fresh, clean white, making a game of it, their laughter echoing down the street. She replaced the broken mailbox and fixed the loose board on the front steps. Nothing extravagant, nothing showy, just the quiet restoration of dignity and order. The neighbors noticed. The Johnsons smiled and waved. The Pratts brought over cookies. Even Martha Henderson ventured across the street one afternoon with a hesitant offer of help, quickly withdrawn when Gerald's sharp voice called her back home. But Margaret's transformation went deeper than paint and landscaping. Working from home allowed her to be present for her children in ways she hadn't been able to manage while working 2 jobs. She was there when the school bus arrived, there to help with homework, there to make dinner that didn't come from a microwave or a drive-through window. The shadows began to fade from Sarah's eyes. Michael's energy returned, his voice filling the house with questions and stories and laughter. Emma stopped setting a place for Daddy, though sometimes Margaret caught her daughter looking at Thomas's photo with a small, sad smile. They were healing slowly, like a bone that had been broken but was finally being set properly. In February, David Chen called with an unexpected proposition. The startup was growing faster than anyone had anticipated, and they needed someone to manage not just accounting but overall operations. "I want to make you my COO," he said. "Chief Operating Officer, significant raise, equity in the company, real decision-making authority. You've earned it, Margaret." She sat in stunned silence, her mind struggling to process the words. 6 months ago, she had been cleaning toilets at midnight and wondering how she would pay the electric bill. Now she was being offered an executive position with a company valued at over $3 million. "I don't know what to say," she finally managed. "Say yes," David replied simply. "You're the best thing that's happened to this company. Don't make me beg." She said yes. The raise was substantial, life-changing. The kind of money that meant she could not only pay bills but save for the children's college, plan for the future, breathe without the constant weight of financial terror crushing her chest. She told the children over pizza that night, their faces glowing with excitement they didn't fully understand but felt in the electricity of their mother's joy. "Does this mean we're rich?" Michael asked. "No, baby." Margaret laughed, pulling him close. "But it means we're going to be okay. Really, truly okay." That night, after the children were asleep, she stood at her bedroom window looking out at the quiet street, at Gerald Henderson's perfectly manicured lawn, and her own modest, hard-won improvements. She thought about Thomas, about how proud he would be, how he had always believed she was capable of extraordinary things. "I did it," she whispered to the darkness. "I actually did it." Spring arrived with unexpected warmth, and with it, changes that rippled through the neighborhood like stones thrown into still water. The startup was acquired by a larger tech company in a deal that made regional news. Margaret's equity stake, suddenly worth actual money, provided financial security she had never imagined possible. She paid off the mortgage, set up college funds for all 3 children, and donated a significant sum to the local food bank where she had once been a client. But she didn't move, didn't leave the neighborhood despite having the means to do so. This house held Thomas's memory, held the children's entire lives, held the story of her survival and resurrection. She wouldn't let Gerald Henderson or anyone else drive her from her home. The neighborhood Easter egg hunt fell on a sunny Saturday in April. Margaret had volunteered to help organize it, along with several other parents. She set up tables, hid plastic eggs filled with candy, coordinated the age groups with the easy authority of someone who had spent months managing complex operations. Gerald Henderson watched from his porch, his expression sour as always. When Martha suggested they contribute decorations, he snorted. "I'm not participating in anything that woman organizes. She's still just a charity case playing dress-up." Martha's face flushed with embarrassment, but she said nothing, had learned long ago that contradicting Gerald only made things worse. The event was a tremendous success. Children raced through the designated yards, their baskets overflowing, their laughter like music. Sarah helped with the younger kids, her natural kindness shining through. Michael found the golden egg that won a special prize and immediately shared the chocolate with 3 other children. Emma danced through the grass in a new dress, her joy uncontained and infectious. Margaret watched her children, watched the community coming together, and felt a deep satisfaction that had nothing to do with money or status, and everything to do with simple human connection. That evening, as Margaret and the children sat on their front porch eating ice cream and watching the sunset, Gerald appeared at the property line. He stood there for a long moment, his face working through some internal struggle. Finally, he spoke, his voice carrying across the yards. "I heard about your new position, Chief Operating Officer. Quite impressive." There was no warmth in his voice, but the acknowledgement itself was startling. Margaret met his gaze steadily. "Thank you, Mr. Henderson." He nodded stiffly and turned away, but not before she saw something flicker across his face. Was it shame? Regret? She couldn't be sure. But Gerald Henderson was not a man who changed easily or admitted error gracefully. Over the following weeks, his comments continued, though perhaps slightly less frequent, slightly less sharp. He complained about the children's bicycles on the sidewalk, about Margaret's car partially blocking his view when she parked, about the fact that her grass was a different shade of green than his meticulously maintained lawn. Each petty criticism was like a small stone thrown at her window, annoying but ultimately harmless. Margaret ignored him, focused instead on her work, her children, the life she was actively building from the ruins of loss. In June, David Chen invited Margaret to speak at a women's entrepreneur conference. "Tell your story," he urged. "There are thousands of women out there who need to hear that it's possible to come back from devastating loss, to rebuild, not just survive." She was terrified, had never spoken publicly before, never considered herself someone whose story mattered beyond her own small family. But she agreed, spent weeks preparing, writing and rewriting her speech, until it captured both the darkness of her grief and the hard-won light of her recovery. The children helped her practice, sitting in the living room like a miniature audience, Emma occasionally shouting encouragement at random moments. The day of the conference, Margaret stood before 200 women and told them everything. She told them about Thomas's death, about the financial terror, about working 2 jobs and surviving on 3 hours of sleep. She told them about the neighbor who mocked her grief and her struggle. She told them about the moment she decided to stop merely surviving and start fighting for something better. She told them about the library books and online courses, the 43 applications in one day, the leap of faith that felt more like stepping off a cliff. Her voice shook, but never broke. When she finished, the room erupted in applause that seemed to shake the walls. Women came up to her afterward, some crying, sharing their own stories of loss and resilience and the exhausting work of rebuilding a life. Margaret realized that her pain, her struggle, had been transformed into something larger than herself, something that could light the way for others walking through similar darkness. A local news station covered the conference and interviewed Margaret. The segment aired during the evening news, 6 minutes of her story interwoven with footage of her home, her children, her ordinary, extraordinary life. She talked about Thomas, about grief, about the American dream that sometimes requires you to wake up from one nightmare before you can dream again. She mentioned, briefly, the neighbor whose cruelty had inadvertently fueled her determination, though she didn't name him. "Sometimes," she said directly to the camera, "the people who try to break us end up being the ones who forge us into something stronger." Gerald Henderson watched the news segment alone in his living room. Martha had gone to bed early, exhausted from a day of volunteer work at the hospital. He sat in his leather recliner, the remote heavy in his hand, and watched the widow from number 37 talk about resilience and hope and transformation. He saw the well-maintained house in the background, saw the 3 children who looked happy and healthy and loved. He heard her talk about the neighbor who had mocked her struggle, and even though she didn't name him, he knew. He knew every word was about him, every subtle reference, every description of casual cruelty, and something cold and uncomfortable settled in his chest. He thought about his own life, stretched out before him like his perfectly trimmed lawn, measured and controlled and ultimately empty. He had retired from a career in insurance claims, 40 years of saying no to people who needed help, finding reasons to deny coverage, to reduce payouts, to protect the company's bottom line. He had been good at it, prided himself on his ability to find the loopholes and exclusions. He had saved his company millions and never spent a moment wondering about the families on the other side of those denied claims. His marriage was cordial but cool, a partnership of convenience more than passion. Martha did her charity work and book club, and he maintained his lawn and judged the neighborhood. They rarely talked about anything that mattered. He had no children. That had been his choice, his insistence. Children were expensive, messy, unpredictable. They would have interfered with his plans, his order, his control. Martha had wanted them once, he remembered, had cried when he refused to reconsider. But she had eventually accepted his decision as she accepted everything else. Now, watching Margaret's children laugh on the television screen, he felt something he couldn't quite name. Not regret exactly. Gerald Henderson didn't do regret. But perhaps the smallest sliver of doubt about the life he had constructed with such rigid precision. The following Sunday, Gerald was trimming his already perfect hedges when he heard shouting from Margaret's house. He looked up to see Sarah burst from the front door, tears streaming down her face, followed by Margaret calling after her. "Sarah, please, just wait. Let's talk about this." But the girl ran down the street, her long legs carrying her past Gerald's carefully maintained property line and around the corner, disappearing from view. Margaret stood on her porch, her hand pressed to her mouth, her whole body radiating distress. For a moment their eyes met across the yards. Gerald looked away first, uncomfortable with the raw emotion on her face. That evening, as darkness fell, Gerald heard more commotion. He stood at his window, watching as Margaret and Michael searched the neighborhood, calling Sarah's name, their voices growing increasingly desperate. Other neighbors joined the search, flashlights bobbing through the twilight like anxious fireflies. The Johnsons checked the park. The Pratts drove through nearby streets. Even Martha went out, despite the late hour, walking slowly through the neighborhood and calling the girl's name. Gerald remained inside, telling himself it wasn't his concern, that the girl would turn up, that teenagers ran away all the time and always came back. But he couldn't stop watching from his window, couldn't stop hearing Margaret's voice cracking with fear as she called for her daughter. Around midnight, Gerald saw the police arrive, saw Margaret speaking with the officers, her arms wrapped around herself as if she were freezing despite the warm night. He saw little Emma clinging to her mother's leg, and Michael trying to be brave but failing, his young face streaked with tears. He watched the officers take a description, saw them show a photo around to the gathered neighbors, heard Margaret's voice rise in near hysteria. "She's been through so much already. She lost her father. She's just a baby. Please, please find her." And Gerald Henderson, standing alone in his dark house, felt something crack in the armor he had spent decades constructing. He thought about his own words, all the small cruelties he had delivered with such casual precision. He thought about a 9-year-old girl hearing her family mocked and judged, hearing her mother's struggle dismissed as laziness, hearing her dead father's memory sullied by implications that they were somehow less than undeserving, wrong. He thought about how children absorb everything, how they carry wounds that adults can't see, how sometimes those wounds make them run into darkness because darkness feels safer than facing another day of judgment and loss. And for the first time in longer than he could remember, Gerald Henderson felt genuinely ashamed. At 1:30 in the morning, unable to bear his own thoughts any longer, Gerald put on his shoes and went outside. Margaret was sitting on her front steps, her phone clutched in her hand, waiting for news. The police had organized a more extensive search. Volunteers were checking the woods behind the school, the creek that ran through the neighborhood, all the places a desperate child might hide. Michael and Emma were finally asleep inside, exhausted from tears and fear. Margaret looked up as Gerald approached, her face haggard with terror. "Mr. Henderson," she said, her voice barely above a whisper. "I can't lose her. I can't lose another person I love. I just can't." Gerald stood awkwardly at the foot of her steps. This man who always had cutting words ready but now found himself speechless. Finally, he managed, "I have a flashlight. I'll help search." Margaret stared at him, surprise momentarily breaking through her fear. "Thank you," she said simply. They searched together in tense silence, checking behind garages and in garden sheds, anywhere a frightened child might seek refuge. Gerald's knees protested the unaccustomed exercise. His back ached, but he kept going, driven by something he didn't fully understand but couldn't ignore. At 2:15, his flashlight beam caught a glimpse of pink fabric behind the Hendersons' own garden shed, tucked in the narrow space between the building and the fence. "Margaret," he called out quietly, urgently, "I found her." Sarah was curled into a tight ball, her face buried in her knees, her whole body shaking. She looked up when the light hit her, her eyes red and swollen, and Gerald saw in that young face an ocean of pain he had contributed to creating. Margaret rushed past him, falling to her knees and pulling her daughter into her arms. "Baby, oh baby, you scared me so much. Why did you run?" Sarah's words came out in gasping sobs. "Because I can't do it anymore, Mom. I can't be the strong one. I can't pretend it doesn't hurt when people say mean things about us. About Dad, about you. I can't keep smiling when everything is so hard. I just wanted to disappear for a while. Margaret held her daughter tighter, rocking her gently. You don't have to be strong, sweetheart. You don't have to pretend. You can be sad and angry and scared. That's okay, that's human. But you can't run away. We face things together, remember? Our family faces things together. Gerald stood frozen, watching this intimate moment of pain and love, and felt the full weight of his own cruelty crash down upon him like a collapsing building. He had done this. Not entirely, not solely, but his words had been part of the burden this child carried, part of the weight that had become too heavy to bear. He had measured his worth by the precision of his hedge trimming, while this family measured theirs by their ability to survive another day. He had judged them for struggling while never acknowledging his own emotional bankruptcy, his own profound failures as a human being. Martha appeared from around the corner, breathing hard from hurrying. She took in the scene, her husband standing helplessly nearby, Margaret clutching her daughter, and something passed across her face, a mixture of sadness and recognition, and perhaps a small glimmer of hope. She moved to Margaret's side, placed a gentle hand on her shoulder. Let's get her inside and warm. I'll make tea. Margaret nodded gratefully, and together the two women helped Sarah stand, guided her toward the house. Gerald followed at a distance, uncertain of his place but unable to simply walk away. Not anymore. Inside Margaret's kitchen, the fluorescent light seemed harsh after the darkness outside. Sarah sat wrapped in a blanket, sipping hot chocolate that Martha had somehow produced from Margaret's cupboards. Michael and Emma woke and came rushing down, clinging to their sister with relief and residual fear. The police were called off, neighbors texted with the good news, and slowly the crisis energy dissipated, leaving behind exhaustion and the harder work of healing. Gerald stood in the doorway, an unwelcome intruder in this family moment, yet unable to leave. Finally, Margaret looked up at him. Mr. Henderson, thank you for finding her. I don't know what would have happened if... Her voice trailed off, unable to complete the terrible thought. Gerald cleared his throat, his voice rough with unfamiliar emotion. Mrs. Thompson, I need to say something. I need to apologize. Not just for tonight, but for everything. For months of cruelty. For words that cost me nothing but cost you and your children so much. For judging you when I had no right, no understanding, no basic human decency. He looked at Sarah, at her young face still blotchy from crying. I'm the neighbor your mother talked about in that news interview. I'm the one who made things harder when they were already impossible, and I'm deeply, profoundly sorry. The room was silent except for the hum of the refrigerator. Sarah looked at him steadily, this man who had loomed so large in her anxiety, and said in a voice stronger than he expected, Why were you so mean to us? We never did anything to you. Gerald felt the question pierce through every defense he had ever constructed. Because, he said slowly, painfully honestly, I measured myself by all the wrong things, by appearance and order and control, and when your family was struggling, when your mother was doing her best against impossible odds, it reminded me that all my measurements were meaningless, that I had spent my whole life building nothing that mattered, and instead of examining my own failures, I criticized yours. It was easier, and it was inexcusable. Martha, standing beside Margaret, spoke for the first time in what might have been years with any real force. Gerald's right. We've lived in that perfect house with our perfect lawn, but we've been dead inside. No children, no real friends, no purpose beyond maintaining appearances. We've watched you build a real life from tragedy while we've been walking corpses. She looked at her husband, tears streaming down her face. I'm proud of you for finally saying it, for finally being honest about what we've become. Gerald reached for his wife's hand, and gesture so unusual that she stared at their joined fingers in wonder. Margaret, exhausted beyond measure but somehow lighter, spoke gently. Mr. Henderson, we all fail. We all fall short of who we want to be. The question is what we do with that knowledge. Do we defend our failures, or do we try to be better? She looked at her 3 children, at Sarah wrapped in her blanket, at Michael's protective arm around his sister, at Emma already falling asleep against Margaret's side. These kids have taught me that every day is a chance to be better than yesterday. Not perfect, just better. That's all any of us can do. The Hendersons left shortly after, walking across the lawn to their house with their hands still joined, talking quietly in a way they hadn't in years. Margaret got her children to bed, tucked them in with extra care, whispered promises of love and safety and togetherness. When she finally lay down in her own bed at nearly 4 in the morning, she thought about the strange turns life takes, how tragedy can reveal both the worst and best in people, how sometimes the people who hurt us most are the ones who are hurting most themselves. She thought about Gerald Henderson's apology, how much courage it must have taken for a man like that to admit being so fundamentally wrong. She didn't forgive him, not entirely, not yet, but she could see a path toward forgiveness, paved with his genuine remorse and her own hard-won wisdom about human frailty. In the months that followed, the neighborhood slowly transformed. Gerald began volunteering at the local youth center, working with troubled teenagers, trying to undo in small ways the damage his judgment might have caused others. Martha started a support group for widows and widowers, helping people navigate the practical and emotional challenges of sudden loss. They never became close friends with Margaret, the wound's too deep for that, but they became better neighbors, better people. The Henderson lawn remained immaculate, but now Gerald sometimes let the neighborhood kids cut across it chasing soccer balls, and that small permission felt like revolution. Margaret continued to build her career, to raise her children, to honor Thomas's memory not through grief, but through living fully and courageously. Sarah healed slowly with therapy and time and the steady love of her family. She learned that running into darkness doesn't solve anything, but that facing darkness together makes it less terrifying. Michael and Emma grew taller, louder, more confident in their place in the world. And sometimes, on warm evenings, the whole neighborhood would gather for impromptu barbecues, and Gerald Henderson would grill hamburgers with an expression that might almost be called contentment. Because he had learned what Margaret already knew, what she had paid such a terrible price to understand, that life isn't measured by perfect lawns or impressive titles or control over circumstances. It's measured by how we treat each other in our darkest moments, by whether we choose cruelty or compassion, judgment or grace, and that every day, no matter how many days we've already lived, we get another chance to choose better. Epilogue. 5 years passed like water flowing downstream, sometimes smooth, sometimes turbulent, but always moving forward. The neighborhood changed in ways both visible and invisible, the kind of transformation that happens so gradually. You only notice it when you look back and realize nothing is quite the same as it was. Margaret's company went public. The startup that had taken a chance on a desperate widow became a major player in financial technology, and Margaret's equity made her genuinely wealthy. But she still lived at number 37, still drove a sensible car, still waved to neighbors from her porch. She had learned that home wasn't about size or luxury. It was about the memories soaked into the walls, the pencil marks measuring children's heights on the doorframe, the spot where Thomas had proposed on one knee in the backyard. She wouldn't trade those ghosts for any mansion. Sarah graduated high school as valedictorian, her speech moving the entire auditorium to tears as she talked about resilience, about the father who taught her kindness, the mother who taught her strength, and even about the neighbor whose cruelty had inadvertently taught her about forgiveness. She was headed to Stanford on a full scholarship, planning to study psychology, determined to help other children navigate grief and trauma. The shadows had never fully left her eyes, but they had transformed into depth, into wisdom beyond her years. Michael had become the neighborhood's favorite teenager, the one parents trusted to babysit, the one who shoveled elderly neighbors' driveways without being asked, who carried groceries and fixed computers, and somehow made everyone feel valued. He looked so much like Thomas now that sometimes Margaret had to catch her breath. He wore his father's watch and carried his father's gentle certainty that the world could be made better through small acts of consistent kindness. Emma, now 10, was pure sunshine in human form. She had been too young to carry the heaviest weight of grief, and that accidental mercy had allowed her to grow up joyful and confident in ways her older siblings were still learning. She organized neighborhood events, started a community garden, convinced the city council to install a playground at the end of the street. She had her mother's determination and her father's heart, and the combination was unstoppable. Gerald Henderson was 72 now, moving slower but somehow more present than he had ever been. The youth center where he volunteered had named a scholarship in his honor, funded entirely by his own donations, for kids from struggling families who wanted to pursue higher education. He had attended every one of Sarah's school plays, every one of Michael's baseball games, every one of Emma's elaborate neighborhood productions. He couldn't undo the past, couldn't take back the words that had cut so deeply, but he could show up day after day, year after year, trying to be the person he should have been all along. Martha Henderson had blossomed in ways no one expected, least of all herself. Her widow support group had expanded to serve 3 counties. She had written a book about late-life transformation, about waking up from a walking coma of conformity and discovering that it's never too late to become the person you were meant to be. She and Gerald had renewed their vows on their 50th anniversary, a small ceremony in their backyard with Margaret's family as honored guests. They still weren't demonstrative people, but they held hands now, spoke gently to each other, had learned that perfection is the enemy of connection. The neighborhood itself had become known for something unusual in suburban America: genuine community. When the Johnsons' house caught fire, every family opened their doors. When the Pratt's son struggled with addiction, the street rallied with support rather than judgment. When new families moved in, they were welcomed into a network of connection that felt increasingly rare in the modern world. Margaret had become the unofficial heart of this community, the person everyone turned to for advice, for perspective, for the kind of wisdom that only comes from being broken and choosing to heal rather than to harden. On a Sunday evening in late spring, the neighborhood gathered for their annual block party. Long tables stretched down the closed-off street, covered with dishes from a dozen different families. Children ran wild with the particular freedom of being surrounded by adults who all watched out for them. Music played from someone's portable speaker, a mix of generations and genres that somehow worked. As the sun began to set, painting the sky in shades of gold and pink, Margaret stood at the edge of the celebration, watching her children laugh with their friends, watching neighbors who had become family. Gerald approached slowly, 2 cups of lemonade in his hands. He offered one to Margaret, and they stood together in companionable silence for a moment. "You know," he said finally, "I think about that night often. The night Sarah ran away. The night I finally saw what I had become." Margaret nodded, sipping her lemonade. "I think about it too, not with anger anymore. More with gratitude. Strange as that sounds." "Gratitude?" Gerald looked at her questioningly. "That night was the night we all stopped performing our roles and became real with each other," Margaret explained. "You became real about your failures. I became real about how close I was to breaking. Sarah became real about her pain, and from that realness we could all actually start healing. Sometimes the worst nights lead to the best mornings." Gerald was quiet for a long moment. "I spent 67 years building walls," he said softly. "It took you and your children to show me that walls don't protect you. They just trap you inside with your own emptiness." He looked at her, his old eyes bright with unshed tears. "Thank you for not moving away. Thank you for giving me the chance to be better." "We all deserve that chance," Margaret said gently. "Besides, you're the best hamburger cook in the neighborhood. We couldn't lose that." Gerald laughed, a real laugh, and squeezed her shoulder briefly before moving away to help with the grilling. Martha found Margaret a few minutes later. "I never properly thanked you," she said without preamble, "for saving my marriage, my life, really." Margaret shook her head. "I didn't do that, you did that. I just happened to be the mirror that helped you see what needed to change." "Still," Martha insisted, "you could have held grudges. You could have made us pariahs in this neighborhood. Instead, you showed us grace we didn't deserve. That's rare, that's precious." She pressed something into Margaret's hand, a small wrapped box. "Don't open it now. Later, when you're alone." As twilight deepened into night, someone started a bonfire in the Johnsons' fire pit. People gathered around, marshmallows on sticks, children growing drowsy against parents' shoulders. Someone asked Margaret to speak, the way they often did at these gatherings, and she stood, feeling the warmth of the fire and the warmth of community that had been forged through struggle and choice and grace. "I'm not good at speeches," she began, which made everyone laugh because she had become quite good at them. "But I've been thinking about something lately, about how we become who we are. I used to think tragedy defined us, that losing Thomas meant I would always be defined by loss. But I've learned that's not true. What defines us is what we do after tragedy, how we choose to respond, whether we become bitter or better, whether we isolate or connect, whether we judge or understand. She looked around the circle at faces illuminated by firelight. This neighborhood could have been just houses next to each other. Instead, it became a community, not because everything was always perfect, but because we chose, over and over again, to be honest with each other, to be vulnerable, to forgive, to help, to show up. Her voice grew softer. Thomas used to say that home isn't a place, it's people who see you truly and love you anyway. I thought I lost that when I lost him, but you all gave it back to me. You became home, and I'm grateful beyond words. There was silence except for the crackling of the fire, and then someone started clapping, and soon everyone was applauding, and Margaret felt tears on her cheeks, good tears, healing tears. Sarah came and stood beside her mother, tall and strong and beautiful. Michael joined them, then Emma, and they stood together in the firelight, a family that had been shattered and reassembled, the cracks visible but filled with gold, stronger for having been broken. Later that night, after the children were finally asleep and the house was quiet, Margaret opened Martha's gift. Inside was a small framed photograph she had never seen before. It showed Thomas at a neighborhood barbecue years ago, before the children, before the comfortable suburban life, just a young man with a brilliant smile and kind eyes, laughing at something just outside the frame. On the back, Martha had written, "I found this in some old photos. I thought you might like to have it. He was lucky to have you. We're all lucky to have you. Thank you for teaching us what grace looks like." Margaret held the photo to her chest and allowed herself to cry, not with the desperate grief of early loss, but with the bittersweet acknowledgement of love that transcends death. "I did it," she whispered to Thomas's image. "I kept our family together. I built something good from the ruins. I hope you're proud." And in the silence of her bedroom, with her children sleeping safely down the hall, and a neighborhood of real community outside her door, Margaret felt something she hadn't felt in 6 years: complete peace. The story could end there, with peace and healing and transformation. But life is never quite that neat. 3 months later, Margaret was diagnosed with breast cancer. Early stage, very treatable, but still cancer, still terrifying, still a reminder that life is fragile and uncertain. When she told the neighborhood, they mobilized with the efficiency of a military operation. Meal trains, driving schedules for treatment, childcare rotations, lawn maintenance, everything she might need before she even knew to ask for it. Gerald and Martha were there through every appointment, every treatment, every moment of fear. They sat with her during chemotherapy, made her laugh when she wanted to cry, held her hand when words weren't enough. Sarah came home from Stanford every weekend. Michael and Emma became more independent, more capable, rising to the challenge the way children do when life demands it. The neighborhood that Margaret had helped create now created a net of support beneath her, catching her the way she had caught so many others. And she survived. 6 months of treatment, a year of recovery, and then a clean bill of health. Her hair grew back silver at the temples, which she kept, a badge of honor, a reminder of battles fought and won. At her 5-year cancer-free celebration, she stood in her backyard surrounded by everyone she loved, and she thought about the strange journey of her life, from suburban wife to desperate widow, to successful executive to cancer survivor to, finally, simply Margaret, whole and complete and grateful for every single complicated, beautiful, painful, joyous moment. Gerald Henderson gave the toast. "To Margaret Thompson," he said, raising his glass, his voice strong and sure, "who taught us that the measure of a person isn't where they start, or even where they end up, but how they treat people along the way, who showed us that forgiveness is possible, that change is possible, that becoming better is always possible, who built a community out of neighbors and a family out of tragedy and hope out of despair. To Margaret." "To Margaret," the crowd echoed, and she looked around at faces young and old, at children she had helped raise, at neighbors who had become family, at Gerald and Martha who had traveled from cruelty to compassion, at her own 3 children who had survived the unsurvivable and emerged beautiful and strong. She looked at the house where Thomas had proposed, where her children were born, where her heart had shattered and slowly, painfully, wonderfully been pieced back together. To all of us, she corrected gently. To all of us who choose every day to be better than yesterday, that's the only toast that matters. And in the golden light of a spring evening, on a quiet street in an unremarkable suburb, a community that had been built on the ruins of judgment and grief and transformation, raised their glasses and celebrated the only thing that truly matters in the end: love that persists, grace that heals, and the stubborn human insistence on choosing hope even when hope seems impossible. Thomas would have been proud. Margaret knew he would have been proud. And that, finally, was enough.